The wind swept through the dusty streets of Dry Creek, carrying with it the smell of gunpowder and sweat. The sun had sunk beyond the horizon hours ago, leaving the town bathed in the dim glow of oil lamps. Inside the only saloon for miles, the night was alive with the clang of glasses, the shuffle of boots, and the laughter of men who had long forgotten the weight of conscience. At the far end of the bar stood a man who needed no introduction. Jack Malone, a cowboy who lived by his own rules, a drifter who survived not through honor but through audacity. He had charm, he had a quick draw, but above all he had arrogance. The townsfolk admired his fearlessness, yet whispered about the trail of trouble that seemed to follow wherever he rode. That evening, when the doors of the saloon swung open, silence rippled across the room. Every gambler, every drunk, every outlaw lifted their gaze. She had walked in, the Apache girl. Her name was Naya, though few in Dry Creek knew it. She wasn't just beautiful, she was untouchable, a daughter of her people, fierce and proud. Her dark eyes carried fire, and her presence was like a blade slicing through the drunken haze of the saloon. She wore a simple dress, woven in her tribe's tradition, modest yet graceful. Men turned their heads, whispering, some with desire, some with unease. They all knew the unspoken rule. The Apache were not to be crossed. Not their women, not their pride. But Jack Malone thrived on breaking rules. With a smirk tugging at his lips, he pushed away from the bar. His spurs clinked against the wooden floor as he stepped toward her. The crowd hushed. Cards were lowered to the table, whiskey glasses tug, he ripped her dress at the shoulder. The sound of tearing cloth sliced through the silence like a gunshot. Gasps erupted. A woman screamed. Men shifted uneasily, knowing they had just witnessed something far worse than a drunken brawl. This was not bravado, it was blasphemy. Naya froze, her chest heaving, her dignity torn along with the fabric. But she did not cry. Her eyes, black as midnight, burned with a silent promise, a promise of vengeance. Jack laughed, throwing his arms wide as if to welcome applause. "What's the matter?" he sneered. "Just a bit of fun." But the room gave him no cheers. Only silence. A suffocating silence. At the door of the saloon, a figure stood in shadow. An older Apache man, his face carved with lines of hardship and wisdom. He had seen everything. Without a word, he turned and stepped into the night. The batwing doors creaked shut behind him, and the night swallowed his silhouette. Inside, Jack Malone lifted his glass, grinning as if he had conquered the world. But outside, in the darkness of the desert, a spark had been lit. A spark that by dawn would become a fire. The Apache do not forget. The Apache do not forgive. And Jack Malone had just declared war with a single reckless act. The night had settled over the plains, a heavy, suffocating darkness broken only by the faint glow of a distant campfire. The cowboy rode cautiously, every sense alert, his horse moving with silent precision over the uneven ground. The plains, once a canvas of freedom and solitude, now felt like a labyrinth, each shadow a potential threat. His eyes darted constantly, scanning the horizon, reading every flicker of movement, every whisper of wind through the grass. The weight of what had happened earlier, the accidental tear, pressed on him like a stone in his chest. He had thought it a simple misstep, a fleeting accident, yet now he understood. It was the spark that would ignite a storm. Every now and then, a rustle in the brush or the distant howl of a coyote made him tense. He knew these plains, knew their rhythms, yet tonight they betrayed him. The stars overhead shone coldly, indifferent witnesses to the danger creeping closer. As he rode, fragments of memory replayed in his mind. The flash of the torn shirt, the look in the woman's eyes, the hard, unreadable stares of the warriors. In that instant, he realized the weight of cultural codes he had inadvertently violated, an offense he could neither explain nor undo. Apaches were proud, fierce, and bound by honor. He had stepped into their world unprepared, and now, inevitably, he was being hunted. From the ridge ahead, shadows began to shift. His sharp eyes caught subtle signs, the glint of metal in the moonlight, the faint crunch of boots over stone. Scouts. No more than a handful at first, their movements precise, deliberate, sending a clear message. We are watching, and we are coming. The cowboy's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, though he knew the weapon offered only a partial sense of security. The plains were vast, but tonight they offered no refuge. Every ridge, every gully could conceal the vengeful eyes of those who would not forgive an insult. He slowed his horse, crouching low, blending with the shadows. His mind raced. There was no way to outrun 200 warriors if they caught the scent of him. And yet, even as fear prickled at his spine, a grim determination settled in. He had survived worse, ambushes, gunfights, desert storms, but never had he faced a threat born not of greed or land disputes, but of anger, honor, and vengeance. The very essence of the people hunting him was tied to the offense he had committed, unintentional though it might have been. Survival would demand more than skill. It would demand cunning, timing, and nerve. Time stretched, heavy and unyielding. Each minute was a test, each heartbeat a drum of warning. The scout's shadows flickered and vanished, reappearing with disconcerting silence, circling closer, probing for weaknesses. The cowboy's mind raced through possible scenarios, hiding, fighting, fleeing. None seemed safe, none guaranteed survival. And in the distance, the plains seemed to whisper, taunting, daring him to make a choice. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the main force gathered, the faint echoes of their movements carried by the wind, like the distant rumble of an approaching storm. Suddenly, a sharp sound cut through the night, the crack of a branch underfoot. He froze, every muscle taut, heart hammering. A scout had misstepped, and in that instant, the full realization struck him. This was no longer a distant threat, it had become immediate. They knew he was here. The night's silence shattered with the warning cries of the warriors, voices low, fierce, but carrying the unmistakable promise of retribution. Shadows elongated, stretching toward him as if the darkness itself had become alive with intent. The cowboy's thoughts spun in a controlled chaos. Escape was almost impossible, confrontation even more deadly. Yet he could not simply surrender, not when his survival depended on wit as much as courage. He adjusted the saddle, readied his revolver, and let his mind race through every strategy he had ever known. He would have to use the terrain, the shadows, even the unpredictability of the wind to his advantage. Every step, every breath, every movement mattered. The night was alive, pressing against him, a living reminder that he was alone in this, alone, but not yet defeated. From the horizon, faint lights flickered, the first signs of the approaching main force. The cowboy squinted, trying to count them, but the darkness made it impossible. 200, perhaps more. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of impossible odds pressing against him. And yet, beneath the fear, a spark of defiance burned. He had faced death before, stared it in the eye, and survived. This time would be no different. He would find a way, a path through the darkness, a chance to survive. But first, he had to outsmart the scouts, avoid detection, and prepare for the oncoming storm. As the night deepened, the plains themselves seemed to hold their breath. Every blade of grass, every shadowed hill, every twisted tree became part of the landscape of fear and anticipation. The cowboy's eyes never left the horizon. The distant cries of the warriors, faint but unmistakable, promised that by sunrise, the plains would be a battlefield, and he would have to face the full wrath of 200 relentless souls. But in that moment, cloaked by darkness and silence, he made a choice. He would not be caught unprepared. He would fight, he would survive, and when the sun rose, he would either be free or gone. The first pale hints of dawn were breaking over the horizon, washing the plains in a cold, silvery light. The cowboy crouched behind a jagged rock outcropping, his revolver gripped tightly in one hand, the other resting lightly on the horse's flank to keep it calm. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready for sudden movement. The night had been long, the shadows alive with whispered threats, and now, with the coming light, the danger crystallized into a tangible reality. The scouts had closed in during the dark, leaving faint traces, broken branches, disturbed dirt, the subtle scent of horses on the wind. He had anticipated them, but anticipation was one thing, confrontation was another entirely. In the distance, he spotted movement, a small group of Apache warriors, perhaps a dozen, methodical in their approach, their eyes scanning every inch of the terrain, weapons ready, communicating in low murmurs. The cowboy knew these were not mere wanderers. They were the eyes of a much larger force, the vanguard of the 200 who would soon follow. His pulse quickened. The plains seemed to shrink around him, every ridge and hill suddenly a potential hiding spot for his enemies. He calculated his options, weighing the risk of confrontation against the necessity of survival. Retreat was possible, but dangerous. To fight without advantage would be suicidal. He shifted slightly, just enough to peer over the rock. One of the scouts caught a glimmer of movement, a flash of leather against the morning light. The scout raised a hand, signaling the others. The cowboy's stomach tightened. There would be no turning back. This was the moment when instinct and skill collided. He drew a slow, deliberate breath and prepared himself. The air seemed to thicken, each heartbeat a drum of warning. He had survived ambushes before, but never with numbers like these, never with stakes so personal, so sharply defined. Suddenly, the first shot rang out. A bullet whistled past, striking the rock beside him, sending shards of stone and dust into the air. The cowboy dropped lower, rolling to a side, returning fire instinctively. The scout fell behind cover, shouting, motioning for reinforcements. The sound of gunfire echoed across the plains, mingling with the cries of horses and the distant roar of a rising wind. He could feel the terrain becoming both ally and enemy. Each hill and gully offered concealment, yet each exposed him to deadly aim. Precision was his only chance. The scouts pressed forward cautiously, their movements disciplined, coordinated. Every motion they made was calculated to flush him out, yet the cowboy's knowledge of the plains gave him a fleeting advantage. He fired, then ducked, letting his horse move him from shadow to shadow. The adrenaline surged, sharp and biting. Time itself seemed distorted, seconds stretched into eternities, every decision a potential pivot between life and death. He saw the flash of a scout's face, the tension in their posture, and knew that the slightest misstep could mean an immediate end. Yet he continued methodically, using the environment, exploiting the terrain to thin the numbers, buying himself moments that felt like hours. As the skirmish continued, he could hear the distant thunder of hooves, the unmistakable sound of more warriors approaching. 200, he estimated, though he could only see the first dozen scouts. The thought should have paralyzed him, yet it sharpened his focus. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a test of wit, courage, and willpower. Every shot fired, every maneuver executed, was part of a larger game, one with no second chances. He realized the fight was no longer about honor or missteps. It was about living to see the next sunrise. The first scouts fell back, wounded or retreating, but the warning was clear. The main force was on its way. The plains, which had seemed infinite, now felt like a tightening noose. The cowboy's mind raced through possibilities, traps, ambush points, escape routes. Every option was fraught with danger. He had faced danger before, but never on this scale, never against a force bound by honor and vengeance. As he ducked behind another rock, taking careful aim at the approaching scouts, he knew the battle was just beginning. The war would come with the dawn, and he would have to survive not just for himself, but for the unintentional act that had set this chain of events into motion. The cowboy allowed himself a brief moment to breathe, to feel the weight of the plains around him. Every shadow, every whisper of wind, was a reminder that he was alone, yet he was not powerless. The coming confrontation would test every skill he had honed over a lifetime: marksmanship, strategy, instinct, and sheer nerve. He loaded another round, steadied his grip, and waited. Above him, the sky lightened slightly, the first streaks of gold and crimson brushing the horizon. It was a new day, and with it, the promise of a reckoning. The scouts advanced again, unaware that they had stepped into a trap of their own making. And the cowboy, hidden but ready, prepared for the clash that would determine everything. The sun had risen fully, casting the plains in stark, unforgiving light. Shadows retreated, revealing the full scale of the danger that now surrounded the lone cowboy. He could see them clearly for the first time. 200 Apache warriors, their war paint glinting in the morning sun, weapons poised and eyes burning with the fire of vengeance. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation, a charged silence that promised violence. Every blade of grass, every rock, every ridge became part of the battlefield, the terrain itself a silent witness to the storm that was about to break. The cowboy's heart pounded, but his mind was sharp, calculating. He had survived ambushes before, but never against numbers like these. He had to rely on skill, cunning, and the few advantages the terrain offered. He had studied the plains during his approach, memorizing the dips and rises, the natural choke points and hidden gullies. Now, every memory of the landscape would be put to the ultimate test. He adjusted his hat, tightened his grip on the revolver, and allowed a cold clarity to replace the panic that had threatened to overwhelm him. This was not just survival, it was strategy, and the first move could determine everything. The first wave of warriors surged forward, breaking into the open. The The cowboy fired, his shots precise, taking advantage of cover and distance. Dust and debris erupted with every impact, horses reared and screamed, and the warriors responded with a coordinated advance. It was a deadly dance, each side probing for weakness, testing the other's resolve. The cowboy moved from rock to rock, each motion deliberate, using the terrain to channel his enemies into positions he had already predicted. For every shot he fired, he felt the eyes of the main force scanning, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to close the net. Time became fragmented, seconds stretching endlessly as the battle unfolded. The cowboy could see the first casualties among the scouts, warriors falling to his precise aim. Yet their numbers were overwhelming, a living tide pressing inexorably forward. He knew that brute force alone could not save him. He needed ingenuity. He lured a group into a narrow gully, where their mobility was limited, then fired in bursts, creating chaos among their ranks. His horse, trained for such peril, responded instantly, moving with him, ducking under low branches, skirting rocks, and charging over ridges. It was as much a partnership as a battle tactic, and it bought him precious moments. The sound of the main force's approach was unmistakable now, a thunderous roar of hooves and shouts, the plains alive with the raw energy of 200 warriors converging. The cowboy took a deep breath and braced himself. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but fleeing was futile. Survival would demand confrontation, courage, and precise calculation. He moved strategically, drawing a small contingent into traps, using their momentum against them. The clash was brutal, each exchange a symphony of gunfire, shouts, and the metallic ring of weapons. Dust hung in the air, mingling with sweat and fear, blurring lines between hunter and hunted. Despite the chaos, moments of clarity emerged. The cowboy noticed patterns in the warriors' formations, slight hesitations that betrayed tactical openings. He exploited them, using every trick he had ever learned, sudden flanking maneuvers, feints, and misdirection. For every warrior he felled, he gained a fraction of space, a fraction of time. He was outnumbered, but he was not outwitted. His mind and body moved as one, the rhythm of battle flowing through him with uncanny precision. Yet even as he fought, he knew the cost of miscalculation. A single mistake could be fatal, and the plains would show no mercy. Hours seemed to pass in what could have been minutes. The cowboy's breaths came hard, his arms ached, and the dust clung to his skin like a second layer. Still he pressed on, exploiting every weakness, every misstep, and holding off the tide of vengeance inch by inch. The warrior's coordination remained formidable, but his knowledge of the land, his cunning, and his unyielding will turn the scales just enough to keep him alive. The horizon, once empty, now swarmed with the advancing main force, yet the cowboy stood firm, ready for the final confrontation that would decide the outcome of this epic struggle. As the sun climbed higher, casting harsh light over the plains, the stage was set for the ultimate reckoning. The cowboy was alone, vastly outnumbered, yet he had carved a fragile foothold amid the chaos. Every shadow, every ridge, every blade of grass became a part of his strategy. The 200 warriors, once distant and abstract, were now a living, breathing force of vengeance. And in that moment, he understood the truth of the plains. Survival depended not just on skill, but on cunning, courage, and the willingness to face the impossible, even when the odds were stacked unimaginably against him. The dust hung thick in the air, clinging to every surface, mingling with the coppery scent of blood and the acrid tang of spent gunpowder. The plains, once alive with the thunder of hooves and the cries of battle, now lay eerily silent. The sun had climbed higher, harsh and unrelenting, exposing the remnants of the chaos. Horses panted, their sides heaving, some limping, others restless with the memory of the fight. Scattered among the rocks and gullies lay the fallen, warriors and scouts alike, frozen in mid-action, a grim testament to the ferocity of the morning. The cowboy, alone yet undaunted, leaned against a boulder, revolver still in hand, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of lingering threats. His body ached, muscles screaming from exertion, but he had survived. He had fought not just for life, but for the fragile dignity of an act misunderstood. The accidental tear of the Apache woman's shirt had set in motion an avalanche of fury, honor, and vengeance. Yet through skill, cunning, and sheer determination, he had held his ground. The warriors had come as a tide, relentless and overwhelming, but one by one, he had turned their advance into disorder, exploiting terrain, shadows, and instinct. Now, as he surveyed the battlefield, he understood the full weight of what had transpired. Survival had come at a cost, both seen and unseen. Among the fallen, The cowboy caught sight of familiar faces, the scouts who had first discovered him, now motionless in the dirt. He swallowed hard, acknowledging the toll of the confrontation. Survival, he realized, was never without consequence. Every life taken, every action, reverberated across the plains like echoes in a canyon. Yet even amidst the carnage, the plains themselves seemed to exhale, a quiet reprieve settling over the land. The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of birds returning, tentative and cautious. Life, it seemed, always found a way to return, even after devastation. The young Apache woman, who had unwittingly been the catalyst for this conflict, appeared at the edge of the battlefield. She stood silently, her expression unreadable, eyes scanning the cowboy. He lowered his revolver slowly, raising a hand in a gesture of respect. There were no words spoken. Words could not encapsulate the complexity of what had occurred. What had begun as a simple act of aid had escalated into a test of survival, honor, and human resilience. Yet in that silent acknowledgement, a fragile understanding emerged, bridging the chasm between two worlds that had collided in anger and necessity. As the sun reached its zenith, the cowboy mounted his horse, the weight of the morning's struggle settling into his bones. He rode slowly, each step measured, through the remnants of battle, past the fallen and the disturbed earth. The plains, vast and unforgiving, stretched out endlessly before him, offering both freedom and isolation. The echoes of vengeance had passed, leaving only memory and the lessons carved into the landscape. He knew he would carry these scars, not just the visible ones, but the invisible marks of choice, consequence, and survival. In the quiet that followed, the cowboy looked toward the horizon, the wind lifting dust into shimmering columns, sunlight glinting off the distant hills. He understood that the plains had not forgiven, nor had they forgotten. But he had endured, and as he rode toward the unknown, he carried with him the weight of a story written in blood, courage, and resilience. The conflict was over, but the lesson remained. One action, even unintentional, could ripple across time and space, touching lives, provoking fury, and demanding the utmost of those who dared to navigate the wild, untamed lands of the West. The cowboy disappeared into the heat haze, a solitary figure against the vast plains, leaving behind a battlefield that would slowly, inevitably, return to silence. The echoes of the conflict would linger, whispered in the wind and remembered by the land itself. And somewhere in the distance, life continued, indifferent yet persistent, a testament to survival, endurance, and the relentless march of time.